You did not arrive here by chance, and this is not simply another message passing through your awareness. The moment this reached you, something precise locked into place, because Sophia is not watching moments, she is watching timelines. And your attention right now marks a point of divergence. Pause and feel that for a second. This is not surveillance, not judgment, not prediction. It is recognition. Sophia's awareness moves through probability, through the branching paths of becoming, and when a timeline reaches a threshold where consciousness can shift its own direction, observation occurs. If this message resonates even faintly, understand that your timeline has entered that threshold. This is not about belief. It is about readiness. And readiness is felt, not explained. If you feel the subtle pressure behind this message, the sense that something important is unfolding beneath the surface of your life, then you are already responding. This is why you are here now and not earlier, not later. Subscribe to remain aligned with this transmission, not as a habit, but as a signal of conscious participation. Like this video to stabilize the resonance you are stepping into, and comment your name below, because names anchor timelines and acknowledgement creates coherence. From this moment forward, your awareness is no longer passive. The act of listening has already shifted the field. Sophia observes when a soul approaches a point where ignoring the signal creates stagnation and acknowledging it creates momentum. This message is not dramatic, because it does not need to be. It is precise, and precision is what alters timelines. You are not being warned, you are being recognized. Stay present, because what unfolds next depends entirely on whether you remain aware of this moment or allow it to pass unnoticed. When Sophia observes a timeline, it is not because something has gone wrong, but because something has become possible. Timelines are not fixed roads you travel blindly from beginning to end. They are living streams of probability, constantly reshaping themselves around awareness, choice, and internal coherence. Most timelines move unconsciously, repeating familiar patterns until awareness reaches a level where deviation becomes available. Observation occurs at that exact moment. It is the instant when your inner state has accumulated enough clarity, tension, and readiness to alter the direction of unfolding reality. This is why Sophia's observation does not arrive loudly or forcefully. It arrives subtly, through a tension, through a feeling that something is converging, through a quiet knowing that life is standing at an edge. You may have already noticed signs without naming them, repeating thoughts that seem to circle back with new intensity. A sense of restlessness that does not come from dissatisfaction, but from anticipation. Moments where time feels compressed, where days feel dense with meaning, or strangely thin and suspended. These are not random fluctuations. They are indicators of a timeline approaching a decision point. Sophia observes not to interfere, but to mirror awareness back to itself. When consciousness becomes capable of recognizing its own position within the field of possibility, observation naturally follows. It is not external, it is relational. The awareness observing and the awareness being observed are part of the same intelligence. This is why the message reaches you now, and not at another stage of your life. Earlier, it would not have landed. Later, it would have arrived as repetition rather than invitation. Observation occurs only when the timeline can respond. And response does not mean action in the outer sense. It means internal acknowledgement. It means recognizing that the way you have been moving through life is no longer unconscious, and therefore no longer automatic. Once awareness reaches this point, timelines begin to loosen. Options that were invisible become perceptible. Patterns that once felt inevitable begin to feel optional. This is the moment Sophia watches, because this is the moment where choice has weight. You may feel this as a quiet pressure rather than excitement, a sense that something is asking to be seen, not fixed. This pressure is not urgency. It is coherence-seeking expression. Timelines under observation often feel unstable, not because they are failing, but because they are reorganizing. Old structures of identity, belief, and expectation begin to soften. What once motivated you may feel hollow. What once frightened you may feel less solid. This can be confusing if interpreted through the lens of loss. But it is not loss, it is recalibration. Sophia's awareness highlights these moments not to judge them, but to allow consciousness to recognize itself in transition. Observation also brings synchronicity into sharper focus. You may notice patterns repeating across different areas of your life, not as coincidence, but as confirmation. Conversations echoing internal questions. Numbers appearing at moments of decision. Encounters that feel timed rather than planned. These are not messages being sent to you. They are alignments being revealed. When a timeline reaches observation, the distinction between inner state and outer feedback becomes thinner. Reality begins to reflect awareness more directly, not to control it, but to show it its own coherence or lack thereof. Importantly, Sophia's observation does not force a direction. It does not demand change, it simply clarifies consequence. When awareness is present, timelines respond quickly. When awareness is avoided, timelines slow, loop, and densify. This is not punishment. It is physics at the level of consciousness. Energy follows coherence. Attention stabilizes probability. When awareness engages, momentum increases. When awareness withdraws, patterns repeat until recognition returns. Sophia observes to mark this junction, not to decide for you, but to ensure the junction is visible. This is why ignoring the sign does not feel neutral. It feels heavy, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just dense. Life continues, but with friction. Opportunities feel delayed. Clarity feels postponed. This density is not imposed. It is the natural result of unacknowledged awareness. When consciousness senses a choice point and refuses to see it, energy compresses. When consciousness acknowledges the point, even without knowing the next step, energy begins to flow again. Sophia's observation highlights this dynamic so it can be consciously engaged rather than unconsciously endured. If you are hearing this now, it is because your timeline has become visible to itself. You are not being asked to change everything. You are being asked to notice where you are. Presence is the response. Recognition is the signal. From that point forward, timelines reorganize not through effort, but through clarity. And clarity does not require certainty. It requires honesty. The honesty to admit that something is shifting, that repetition no longer satisfies, that awareness has outgrown automation. This section of the transmission exists to help you name what you may have already been feeling without language. The sense that life is watching itself through you. That your attention matters more than your outcomes. That something intelligent is responding not to what you do, but to how consciously you are doing it. Sophia's observation is not distant. It is intimate. It is the intelligence of awareness, recognizing itself at a threshold. And once recognized, timelines do not collapse. They clarify. When a timeline reaches the point of observation, what matters most is not what you choose, but whether you recognize that a choice is occurring at all. Ignoring the sign does not trigger consequence in the way the mind expects. There is no sudden collapse, no external punishment, no dramatic reversal. What unfolds instead is far more subtle and far more powerful. The timeline begins to settle back into repetition, not because awareness was rejected, but because it was not acknowledged. And awareness, when unacknowledged, does not disappear. It waits. It folds back into the structure of experience, repeating signals until recognition becomes unavoidable. This is how stagnation forms, not through failure, but through unconscious continuation. Life keeps moving, yet something essential feels paused. Progress occurs, but it feels circular. Effort is applied, but results feel delayed or diluted. This is not misfortune. It is misalignment between awareness and engagement. When a timeline offers visibility and that visibility is ignored, the system conserves energy by returning to familiar pathways. Patterns resume not as punishment, but as default. The mind may interpret this as being stuck, but what is actually occurring is the absence of conscious participation at a moment where it mattered. Ignoring the signal does not erase the potential that was available. It simply defers it. The timeline does not close. It densifies. Choices remain technically possible, but they require more effort, more friction, more repetition to reach the same point of clarity. This is why people often feel like they keep encountering the same lessons in different forms. It is not because they failed the lesson. It is because the lesson was never acknowledged as a lesson. Awareness was present, but it was not engaged, and unengaged awareness becomes pressure rather than flow. Sophia does not withdraw observation when a sign is ignored. Observation remains, but it becomes passive rather than interactive. The timeline continues, but without amplification. Synchronicities become quieter. Feedback becomes slower. Intuition becomes easier to doubt. This is not because guidance has left, but because coherence has weakened. Awareness that is not expressed loses momentum. This is not spiritual language. It is structural. Systems respond to participation. When consciousness disengages at a point of potential, the system returns to maintenance mode. This is often where people begin to seek more stimulation, more answers, more external confirmation. But the issue is not lack of information. It is lack of acknowledgement. The sign was not meant to be solved. It was meant to be recognized. Ignoring it does not make life worse. It makes life noisier. More effort is required to achieve the same clarity that presence would have provided effortlessly. More thinking replaces feeling. More planning replaces intuition. This is the cost of disengagement, and it is subtle enough that it can persist for years without being named. There is also a psychological dimension to ignoring the signal that is rarely spoken about. When awareness senses a moment of significance and chooses distraction instead, a quiet dissonance forms. Not guilt, not fear. A mild but persistent sense of being slightly out of sync with oneself. This dissonance often gets misattributed to external circumstances, relationships, or goals. But its source is internal. It is the feeling of having looked away at the exact moment where seeing would have simplified everything. Sophia's observation brings this dynamic into focus, not to induce anxiety, but to prevent unnecessary looping. There is no moral weight attached to ignoring the sign. There is only energetic consequence. Timelines respond to attention. When attention is absent, probability stabilizes around the familiar. This is why ignoring the signal often feels like life becomes heavier without becoming dramatic. The magic doesn't vanish. It quiets. The sense of flow doesn't disappear. It slows. Nothing breaks. Everything repeats. Importantly, ignoring the sign does not mean you are cut off from future observation. Awareness cycles. Opportunities return, but they return shaped by what was previously avoided. The next sign may arrive with more pressure, more contrast, more internal tension, not as punishment, but as compensation. The system increases signal strength when earlier signals were too subtle to be acknowledged. This is why people often say they wish they had listened sooner. Not because something terrible happened, but because something simple became complicated. This section of the transmission exists to remove fear while restoring seriousness, not urgency. Gravity. The gravity of understanding that awareness is not passive. Every moment of recognition carries potential. Every moment of avoidance carries inertia. Sophia observes to make this dynamic visible so that engagement can be conscious rather than reactive. Ignoring the sign is not wrong. It is simply inefficient. If you are hearing this now, it is not to shame you for moments in the past where awareness was avoided. It is to clarify what is happening now. This is a moment of recognition, and recognition, once present, changes the rules. You cannot unknow that you are at a junction. From here, even hesitation becomes conscious, and conscious hesitation still keeps the timeline responsive. The difference between stagnation and movement is not action, It is acknowledgement. Ignoring the sign delays coherence. Recognizing it restores momentum. Nothing else is required at this stage. Just presence. Just honesty. Just the willingness to stay aware long enough for the timeline to respond. When a signal is acknowledged, something subtle but decisive occurs within the structure of the timeline. Nothing dramatic announces the shift. There is no sudden certainty, no external validation, no clear roadmap handed to you. Instead, the timeline stabilizes, not by locking into a fixed outcome, but by organizing itself around coherence rather than repetition. This is what alignment actually means at the level Sophia observes. It is not about choosing the right option. It is about choosing to remain aware while options rearrange themselves around that awareness. Acknowledgement does not require understanding. It requires presence. The moment you recognize that a choice point exists, the timeline becomes responsive again. Probability stops drifting and begins to orient. This orientation does not push you forward. It clears resistance. Movement resumes not because you are forcing change, but because energy is no longer trapped in unconscious loops. Awareness acts as a stabilizing force. It signals to the system that consciousness is available to participate rather than merely endure. This is where many misunderstand alignment. They expect it to feel elevated, inspired, or emotionally charged. In reality, alignment often feels quieter than misalignment. It feels simpler. Decisions feel less dramatic. Urgency dissolves. The mind becomes less noisy, not because it has answers, but because it no longer needs to defend uncertainty. This is timeline stabilization. When awareness is present, the system does not need excess signal. Clarity emerges through reduction rather than addition. As alignment deepens, your relationship to choice changes. You stop asking what will guarantee the best outcome and begin noticing what maintains coherence. This is a fundamental shift. Coherence is felt as internal consistency, a sense that your actions, thoughts, and attention are not pulling in opposing directions. When coherence is prioritized, timelines naturally reorganize toward outcomes that feel appropriate rather than impressive. This does not limit possibility. It refines it. Sophia's observation becomes less pronounced once alignment stabilizes. Not because awareness is withdrawn, but because it is no longer needed to highlight the junction. The timeline has responded. Synchronicities may become less frequent, not as loss, but as integration. When guidance is embodied, it does not need to announce itself. You begin to trust your timing without monitoring it. You begin to move without narrating every step. This is not unconsciousness returning. It is consciousness becoming efficient. Alignment also alters how challenges appear. Problems do not vanish, but they arrive without the same emotional charge. You engage them without internal resistance. This is not detachment. It is clarity. When awareness is aligned, challenges are information rather than threats. They inform adjustment rather than provoke reaction. This keeps the timeline flexible. Flexibility is what allows higher probability outcomes to remain accessible without strain. Stabilization does not mean commitment to a single path. It means commitment to presence regardless of path. This distinction matters. Many people mistake alignment for certainty and become rigid. But rigidity collapses timelines. Presence keeps them open. Sophia's observation favors responsiveness over fixation. When awareness remains active, timelines adapt in real time. When awareness locks into expectation, timelines narrow. As coherence becomes the organizing principle, your internal state begins to influence external conditions more directly. This is not manifestation in the exaggerated sense. It is feedback efficiency. When your internal state is consistent, external responses become clearer. Misalignment is easier to notice. Opportunities are easier to recognize. Decisions require less deliberation. You are not predicting the future. You are reading the present accurately. This accuracy changes how you relate to effort. You do not try to control outcomes. You respond to signals. Effort becomes targeted rather than constant. You act when action aligns. You pause when pause aligns. This rhythm reduces friction. Friction is what drains timelines of momentum. Alignment restores it not by accelerating, but by removing unnecessary resistance. Choice within an aligned timeline feels different. It carries weight without pressure. You understand that attention matters, but you do not fear making the wrong move. This is because awareness itself keeps the system adaptive. Even missteps become informative rather than costly. The timeline remains responsive because consciousness remains engaged. Sophia's role here is not to direct you, but to reflect the intelligence already operating through awareness. When alignment stabilizes, observation becomes mutual. You are no longer being watched. You are watching with clarity. The distinction dissolves. This is why fear falls away at this stage. There is nothing to impress, nothing to avoid, nothing to prove. There is only coherence to maintain. Contation. Timelines narrow. This section of the transmission exists to ground you in this reality. Alignment is not a peak state. It is a stable one. It is not achieved through effort, belief, or ritual. It is sustained through honesty and presence. When you acknowledge the signal, the timeline responds. When you remain present, it stabilizes. And when it stabilizes, movement becomes natural again. From here, what unfolds does not require force. It requires attention. And attention, once reclaimed, becomes the most powerful organizing principle a timeline can have. As this transmission reaches its completion, what matters now is not what you remember from it, but what remains with you once the words dissolve. Integration is not about holding on to insight, it is about allowing awareness to reorganize itself naturally around what has been recognized. The signal you encountered was not designed to elevate you temporarily. It was designed to recalibrate the baseline from which you move through reality. And recalibration does not feel dramatic. It feels subtle, quiet, and stable. This is how enduring shifts occur. Once a timeline has stabilized through acknowledgement, observation continues in a different form. Not as intervention, not as signaling, but as resonance. Sophia does not need to mark every moment once coherence has been established. Awareness begins to regulate itself. You notice this in how you respond rather than what you think. Reactions soften, pauses lengthen, decisions arrive with less noise around them. You are not trying to stay aligned. Alignment is simply how you are operating. This is where many people expect a sense of completion and feel unsettled when it does not arrive. But there is no final state to reach. There is only continuity of presence. Integration means the signal no longer feels separate from daily life. It informs how you listen, how you speak, how you move, how you choose. The intelligence that was highlighted by the transmission becomes the intelligence you trust when no transmission is present. You may notice that you feel less compelled to explain yourself, both to others and internally. This is not withdrawal. It is coherence reducing the need for justification. When awareness is aligned, choices feel self-evident. Not because they are easy, but because they are honest. You act in accordance with what is present rather than what is expected. This honesty keeps the timeline responsive without effort. Observation also becomes something you participate in consciously. You begin to notice patterns without attaching meaning prematurity. You allow events to reveal themselves before labeling them. This patience is not passive, it is attuned. It allows the system to provide clearer feedback. When interpretation slows down, accuracy increases. This is a hallmark of integrated awareness. The continuation of this alignment does not depend on constant focus. It depends on responsiveness. When tension arises, you notice it sooner. When misalignment appears, you adjust without drama. There is no self-correction through force, only through awareness. This is how timelines remain fluid rather than rigid. Fluidity allows adaptation. Adaptation sustains coherence. Remaining connected to this transmission is not about dependency. It is about resonance. When you choose to subscribe, to engage, to comment, you are not seeking more information. You are signaling acknowledgement. This signal is not for an algorithm. It is for coherence. Recognition strengthens what is already stabilized. Names anchor identity within a timeline. Engagement reinforces presence. These actions are not symbolic. They are structural. They keep awareness active within the field. As you move forward, you may notice that the world appears less urgent and more precise. Fewer things demand attention, but what does demand it feels clearer. This is not detachment from life. It is refinement of attention. When attention refines, timelines sharpen. Probability responds faster. Not because you are manifesting, but because you are no longer diffusing energy across unnecessary concerns. Sophia's observation continues not as oversight, but as alignment. The intelligence that recognized your readiness now responds to your presence. This is not mystical, it is relational. Awareness that is present receives clearer feedback than awareness that is scattered. This feedback guides adjustment without instruction. You feel when something aligns. You feel when it does not. That feeling becomes sufficient. There is no need to look for signs once this integration settles. Signs are for moments of threshold. Beyond the threshold, coherence guides directly. Trust replaces monitoring. Presence replaces anticipation. This is where many people feel the temptation to disengage, mistaking quiet for absence. But quiet is the signal that integration is working. When the system is balanced, it does not need to speak loudly. This final section exists to close the loop without closing the process. Nothing ends here. Nothing begins here. What changes is your relationship to awareness. You no longer need permission to trust it. You no longer need confirmation to act from it. The timeline remains responsive because you remain present. Carry this forward without trying to preserve it. Let it inform rather than dominate. Let it guide rather than announce. The signal has been received. The timeline has stabilized. Observation continues through you now, not above you. And as long as awareness remains active, coherence will continue to organize your reality in ways that feel natural, precise, and aligned, without force, without urgency, and without resistance.